going to move into a sort of final session where we sort of step back a bit and reflect on both of your presentations. So thank you so much, both of you. That was fantastic. Emily, can I pass over to you?
Jack, are we able to just quickly share my slides? Oh, perfect. Thank you. Magic. So it's just to draw together really a couple of, I suppose, principles and thoughts. And we work at the Institute for Community Studies regularly in participatory evaluation, place-based evaluation, civic evaluation, as well as much more specific targeted forms. And these were just a few reflections that I drew together. Oh, the slides have disappeared, but I think they'll come back. Just a few reflections that I drew together over the course of the couple of presentations. Jack, could we go? There we go. I mean, these are really reflections from our work, but also I think touch upon many of the things that the speakers have talked about, which is really the sense of not just deciding your impact or determining your impact, but actually challenging your impact consistently, and not just at the beginning of when you set out to launch an evaluation process or when you step in to try and understand the impact of existing activity, but actually continuously during the evaluation process. And really the central things around challenging your impact is primarily agreeing expectations, and I think both of the case studies have really touched upon this, but actually ensuring that we're coming at this from a university perspective, as I think Mark and Jonathan were really touching upon. The expectations of the impact you can achieve can themselves be a burden on a local area if they aren't the right ones and if they don't feel equitable. So just because the university community might agree what's important and what kind of impact you want to have, and of course because we're all behind the civic mission, we're all very invested in this concept and it's a good one, but how do you know if expectations of this are shared? And I think that's a really important one, and how means have you done that consultation process? Have you done enough engagement to feel certain that the impact that you're trying to have actually is shared and meets that of local stakeholders and local communities? Linked to this is something that we come up against a lot, particularly at project level, which is the civic partner promise, which is both sort of just very much down to language in terms of what do you tell the civic partners you're working with that your project or your institution is going to do, and can you hold yourself to that? But it's how do you form impact that actually challenges yourself, and how do you then hold the institution accountable to that? And I think both case studies provided some really interesting frameworks, but it is very much to think about evaluation and impact as a promise and not just as something that people are not going to care about, I suppose, at the community level. Balance, and I think this is something that Mark and Jonathan really identified. Evaluation, when it's done best, should pick up and not be afraid to pick up the negative impacts that the university or the institution's activity might be having, as well as building a positive contribution. So very often we build evaluation methods or frameworks that actually just seek to capture positive benefit coming from actions, and we don't actually make space. I appreciate it's very, it can be very intimidating. No one really wants bad news. But if we make space to actually identify negative impacts, working on those and turning those around can be just as valuable at place-based level as building new positive contributions. And increasingly, we're getting requests to develop evaluation frameworks that really seek to correct issues in relationships, to correct kind of negative impacts that institutions, whether that's local authorities, whether that's a university, whether that's a charity, feel that they're having, and that's just as valuable as the positive story. Outcomes, I think it goes without saying, not every department or function within a university needs to deliver the same impact, and they can't either. So I think diversity of outcomes, but then coherence, so what can aggregate up the impact of these activities, and there's a lot of methods that we use that do the deliberate aggregation, but I think that comes to that sense of aims and aspirations. What is everybody in agreement that you're working towards, and is that a framework? Is that a learning model? Is that a matrix? Is it a set of outcome statements? The coherence, I think, is very important, so that this goes on to the next point. You're resolving and not creating And so often, you know, and I when I was working in universities before, you would realize that there was a tension between your international strategy, for example, and your place-based strategy. And there was a tension between the outcomes that perhaps, you know, we were trying to deliver through widening participation versus our attempt to, you know, sort of excel above and beyond as an elite research institution. And you know, they don't have to be in tension, everything can be resolved, but it's really important to check in with whether or not the kind of outcomes you're seeking actually come into conflict with some of the other outcomes the university has to deliver, and indeed with other agendas locally. And I think that goes back to that point on agreeing expectations and agreeing, you know, a shared kind of vision that the university is part of. And then that really important point, which I think Sarah mentioned, which is not being too rigid and leaving room to capture unexpected impact. And if I go to my next slide, really this is responding to the kind of bubble in the right hand side of the screen, which is it is always better to fan out in terms of the impact you are seeking to make than to have to contract in because we've overpromised or we've overreached ourselves. And fanning out, I suppose, means that when you start to think about those outcome statements, actually being realistic and being specific and being smaller scale is a better starting point. And then trying to say, oh, we're actually going to, you know, we think we can have a huge impact on a large social issue, and then realizing that actually it's very, very difficult, you know, because a lot of these problems are systemic, to make that happen. And also to deliver that, we all know the pressures of delivering within time, to make that happen and show difference within a, you know, a 2 to 3 year, you know, sort of budget format. So really, I think fanning out it from smaller impact statements, but then using methods and qualitative methods and interviews, you know, sort of that kind of reflective, creative methods can be really good at then capturing the wider, unexpected forms of impact that you're having in local areas. And obviously, community voice, we would always say, is a crucial part of that. But there are lots and lots of different approaches that work with different stakeholders to do that. Just to pick up on a couple of other things on this slide, I think the question of what impact are we looking for is really where a lot of this starts on, and then challenging yourself with what can we deliver out of this. So you might have a really big, you know, statement about addressing a social issue. You know, the case studies here have talked a lot about kind of being really, really astute and reflective about what are the challenges in your local area. But I think then taking a step back and saying, so even if we know this is the right outcome, what are we going to deliver of this as the university? But then who else can we work with who can contribute to solving other parts of this challenge? And seeing it as a joint exercise with a joint set of outcomes that you can evaluate can be much more effective, because this goes to the point about your identity as an institution. There are things that universities absolutely should be working on in place and contributing to. Not all universities can do that other universities can, and you know, some of this seems obvious, but it's helpful to remind that our civic mission doesn't have to be as all-encompassing. You know, it doesn't have to be the one civic mission to rule them all, to use a sort of Lord of the Rings frame there. And speaking to the identity that you feel you have as an institution, and setting up your outcomes to reflect that, will in the end, you know, result, I think, in a better you know, delivery against those outcomes, but also in a better the local area, those overreaching and then having to rein back from that. Other things in there is just around ownership and accountability, and I think the case studies have really picked up on, you know, how difficult is it to get this embedded, and you really do need the will, and you need resource, and you need support. But there are also ways, I suppose, of, if you start the conversations from a point of asking, you know, what impact does the local stakeholders and the local community think we should have? How can you then build ownership beyond the institution, which will in the end enable you to propel things forward? Even if, for example, you have a change of personnel at the top, you know, if you have a supportive group of stakeholders, you know, a civic advisory board that is governing your framework, for example, it avoids the kind of risk of loss of momentum if somebody moves on from a senior position and then, you know, that crucial resource is lost, for example. And just to go to my final slide, just, I suppose, a little bit of a sense of principles, and we will be sharing all of these later, so I'm not going to go through all of them because you've heard a huge amount already, and there was much more depth in the case studies. But just a reminder to think, when you're starting to think about evaluating your civic activity, what are you already doing that perhaps you're not capturing? You know, sort of an evaluation doesn't need to mean starting new projects or new activities and building evaluation around that. It can just be working out a sensitive, appropriate way to capture and also capture, as I said, unexpected outcomes. All impacts within that should be captured, and this goes back to my point on negative and positive and a do no harm principle. But then prioritize what impacts you're going to act upon, and that really then goes back to the realistic point. The second step, really, what can you realistically do that's extra on top of what you're already doing, and then how to measure this. And my crucial point I really wanted to bring out there, and this links very much to, I loved Sarah's point about the process of evaluation and what that can give to stakeholders and communities. But also just a little cautionary reflection that the weight of the process that you put in to evaluate should really take into account and match the experience that the civic partners are going to have. So just a kind of, we talk a lot to communities about how they can feel overburdened by evaluation activities, you know, by taking part. And then they ask, well, you know, sort of what is the purpose of this for? Is it just to report back to the university? So just I think, I suppose, a kind of plea to sort of think about, you know, we want to run a really participatory, you know, sort of positive process, but does that match the community's experience of it and what they're getting out of it in terms of what activities you're putting in to evaluate? And then what can you challenge the institution to do differently or more of, I suppose, being the final step on that? And does this fit with the other university strategies? And also, is there agreement in the university that where we locate impact is also going to be about change that the university can make to itself in terms of how that shapes the university's values, work and practice? And I think really that reciprocal back and forth kind of sense is what evaluation, when it's done best, can really achieve. And that's not to say that it doesn't require a huge amount of positive buy-in and a huge amount of being willing to kind of accept that kind of mirror back. But really, I think if we're talking about a kind of universities truly being a civic part of community, it's also recognizing when perhaps the university learns something about itself and thinking about how strategies or values or activity might have to change.